Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is in London this morning on an unannounced visit. In a tweet, Zelenskyy said he would meet UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and British delegations for what he called substantive negotiations. Zelenskyy has been meeting Western leaders to bolster support for Ukraine. On Sunday evening, he held talks with French President Emmanuel Macron in Paris. Macron pledged new tanks and armoured cars to Ukraine. The leaders also jointly called for fresh sanctions on Russia. Frank Lebwich is a senior lecturer in strategy and law and a former military intelligence officer and joins us now. Frank, Volodymyr Zelenskyy seems to be on a European tour to restock Ukraine's military arsenal. What can he expect from the UK?
Well, good morning, Gerhard. Last week, as you know, the UK announced the donation of some Storm Shadow cruise missiles, which do represent a gear change. But actually yesterday, there was another announcement, which is probably more significant on the military front, and that is a couple of hundred drones. Now, the interesting thing about this is that it's part of a program the UK has been developing to bring these online very quickly. They're said to have long range, 200 kilometers. And what that does is two things. First of all, it's going to give Ukraine the capability to strike far behind Russian lines. But more importantly, more strategically, both the Storm Shadow British cruise missile donation plus this drone announcement puts pressure on the US now to open the doors for its long-range missiles, just as the British donation of 14 Challenger tanks did to European and American tanks for them earlier this year. So it's a significant move, actually, in terms of Ukrainian capabilities.
Now, let's talk a bit more about these capabilities. France also promised more military aid. Germany has offered almost 3 billion euros more in military aid. Will any of that come in time for the expected spring offensive?
No, none of it will. What Zelenskyy is trying to do here is focus on sustainability. I was in Ukraine a couple of weeks ago listening to Ukrainian commanders and political leaders, and their focus is on sustainability, is on trying to keep the momentum going. There are even reports that Ukraine sees another offensive after this one in the spring and summer, if we can call it that. And for that, of course, they're going to need a continuing supply. The problem they have is that the numbers they're getting don't meet their needs. So I'll give you one example, a famous one, tanks. The Ukrainian commander Zaluzhny asked for 300 tanks for this series of campaigns. He's received less than 100. And my concern is that the material isn't coming in fast enough or in sufficient quantities to secure Ukrainian success.
Now, I want to pick your brain about something that happened over the weekend. The Russians appear, at least, to have hit a major Ukrainian weapons depot. How much of a setback could that be?
Yes, very interesting this, isn't it, Gerhard? If the Russians had focused on this kind of strike instead of trying to immiserate and kill civilians over the winter, they might have had a bit more progress in their strategic bombing campaign. It's difficult to say how significant. It's part of a series of strikes. This one was at Khmelnytsky, a pretty big explosion, I think you would agree. There was another one at Pavlodar just a couple of weeks ago. And indeed, the Ukrainians suffered from such strikes during the 2014 to 22 war, because that's when the war started, which diminished their artillery ammunition capacity. So, yes, it's it's certainly a blow to the Ukrainians. It's difficult to say the depth of it, but I'm sure they're going to be focusing now on defending those assets far more intensively.
Military analyst Frank Ledwidge there. Thank you very much, Frank.
Thank you, sir.
Now, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is in the UK, the latest stop on his whirlwind European tour. Zelenskyy's visit follows a pledge by the UK's Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, to provide Ukraine with hundreds of air defence missiles and long-range attack drones to fend off Russia's invasion. Zelenskyy was greeted by Sunak at Chequers, which is the British leader's official country retreat. It's the fourth European country that Zelenskyy is visiting in the past few days. The Ukrainian leader is seeking more aid as his military prepares a long-anticipated spring offensive. Now, Domitilla Sagramoso is a senior lecturer in security and development at King's College London and joins us now. Good to see you, Domitilla. Can you tell us what Volodymyr Zelenskyy can expect from his talks with the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak?
I think what we can expect is that the UK will probably confirm what has already been promised in terms of air defense equipment, as you mentioned, long-range missiles, which have already been delivered to Ukraine, and sort of commitment in the short and medium term and potentially also long term of support to Ukraine. And I think what is really interesting about this trip, that Zelenskyy has carried out also to other European capitals, is really to show that the big four sort of European economic countries, the strongest economic countries in Europe, are committed to providing, support to Ukraine, not only in the short term, but also in the medium term, sort of to support this various, probably there's going to be various counteroffensives, and to show that, that Europe is ready sort of in a way to also play its part in providing support to Ukraine, which I think is very relevant at this moment.
I did want to ask you about how all of this looks, because while Zelenskyy is visiting, one major ally after another in Western Europe, we've got Russia's Vladimir Putin, who's essentially a political pariah, subject to an arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court. What do you think the Russian president is thinking when he sees the kind of welcome that Zelenskyy is getting here in Western Europe?
Well, on the one hand, I think Putin is worried because the criminal court indictment, creates difficulties for him to move around. We know there was this case with South Africa. It's not clear whether he can go or not. Whereas Zelenskyy, of course, is received very welcomely, sort of in the so-called Western world. But I think for Russia at this moment, this is Putin's not real worry. I think what he's really worried now is to make sure he gets the necessary support internally and also among his key allies, to help him succeed in the war in Ukraine. And for him now, his sort of strategic partnership, I wouldn't call it a military alliance, but sort of a very significant partnership with China is very relevant. The military partnership, which is developing with Iran, the support he might get from African countries, South Africa. There was also apparently evidence that Egypt was going to provide support to Russia, but this was uncovered by the Americans, and then it had to be stopped. So I think Putin is now focusing on those parts of the world that can be providing diplomatic, political, military, and also economic support, in terms of markets for Russia. Mm-hmm. So I think this is not really what is worrying him at the moment. But certainly, from the point of view of prestige, it's not something that Putin, is very happy about.
If we could just spend a moment talking about what's actually happening in Ukraine. The Russian military appears to have successfully hit a major Ukrainian weapons depot over the weekend. How much of a setback might that be for Ukraine's plans for a spring offensive?
Yeah, well, it is not clear, but it seems, there are different views about whether it was an ammunition depot. But if we assume that it was, which I cannot confirm, this may indicate, that the Russians have identified the locations, this is what is worrying. It is expected in a war that, there are going to be these kinds of attacks. So I think, while it might be worrying in the short and the immediate term, this is part of the nature of warfare, that, you're going to lose assets. Your enemy is going to find out where some of the location of your important assets are, and you have to plan accordingly. So I think here what is relevant is to find out if this really was an attack on ammunition depots, how did the Russians find out? What can be done to make sure there is no concentration of ammunition in one particular place that can become an easy target? And how do you sort of spread out your assets and your military resources?
Domitilla Sagramoso from King's College London, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Straight to our correspondent in the Ukrainian capital, Nick Connolly in Kyiv. Welcome, Nick. Russia claims that these British long-range Storm Shadow cruise missiles have already been used to attack targets in occupied Luhansk. What's the Ukrainian military saying about this?
Well, they never comment on these kinds of things, but certainly experts, pundits with very close ties to Ukrainian authorities, Ukrainian military, are basically talking about this as a fact. And we've certainly seen pictures of bits of these missiles with inscriptions in English that seem to look credible from that impact site in Luhansk. And I think the real kind of game changer is clear from the fact that Luhansk is more than 100 kilometers away from where the closest position of the Ukrainian army is. As a result, visiting Russian politicians have thought this was a safe place to take some pictures and to kind of get a bit of a sense for life on the front lines while not really risking their personal safety. And we've seen a member of Russia's parliament, the Duma, getting injured there because they just obviously weren't aware that these missiles were already in Ukraine, that they were already in a position to strike these kinds of targets. And we've seen a whole number of hits in the last few days, far, far away from anything that Ukraine was able to do before. Previously, they just had the HIMARS rocket artillery system that has a range about 80 kilometers, at least, with the munitions that Ukraine has so far received. So this really does change the geography. Basically, there is no target left in Russian-occupied Ukraine, either in Crimea or in the east, that is now outside of the range of these missiles. We don't know, it has to be said, how many of these missiles were provided. They are not cheap. They're estimated to be about just under €1 million each. But for high-value targets, especially now where Ukraine is expected to start a counteroffensive anytime soon, and it obviously needs to try and attack Russian logistics and make those Russian positions as vulnerable as possible, this is help that is very needed and that is coming at pretty much the perfect time for Ukraine's military planners.
Of course, there have been concerns expressed that providing Ukraine with these sorts of long-range weapons could lead Russia to escalate its attacks. And then we see that Russia's attacked a major Ukrainian munitions depot in Khmelnytsky. So are people linking these two developments?
Well, first of all, Russia's been targeting these Ukrainian targets far, far in the west of the country, near Ukraine's borders with the EU since the beginning of this war. So this is nothing new. I think it's important to state here that there was a proviso when these missiles were provided that Ukraine would only use them on its own territory, on its internationally recognized territory. So that obviously includes Russian-occupied Crimea, but not against targets in Russia proper. So that kind of red line that Russia could claim if, the Ukrainians were to use those Western weapons against targets close to their borders, but on internationally recognized Russian territory, that hasn't been crossed. And I think if you look at the discrepancy between what Ukraine has in terms of capacities and what Russia has, it still is a long way away from parity. Day in, day out, Russia launches cruise missiles over the Caspian Sea. They fly over 1,000 kilometers. Right now, Ukraine has just been given missiles that fly just under 300 kilometers. So there is no question of Ukraine getting the kind of full gamut of what the West could potentially give this country. So I think this is an attempt by Russia to try and browbeat, especially Western European countries who are scared of some kind of escalation, into kind of dialing down on those deliveries, but it just doesn't stack up if you look at the actual kind of capacities on the ground. The kind of view here from Kiev would be that, quite the opposite. Giving more weapons to Ukraine does not lead to more casualties, it actually accelerates Ukraine's ability to take back territory and to end this war. That is the view seen here from Kiev, and they argue that if basically the West were to kind of reduce support, it wouldn't stop Ukraine from carrying on fighting. It would just mean that the war drags on for longer and more people die in trench warfare of the kind of, of the quality we've seen in Bakhmut over recent months.
It's interesting watching President Zelensky's diplomatic efforts. He's been very successful in moving what you might call Western red lines, starting with tanks and jets, and then he got the tanks, and then he's got the former Russian MiGs, the former Soviet MiGs, and now the UK, in February, I think it was, has been offering to train Ukrainian pilots on the use of Western jets. So does this look like that Mr. Zelenskyy might be edging closer to getting what he wants, those Western fighter jets?
Well, he's certainly a media pro and someone who's able to harness and speak to public opinion in all those Western European countries. Obviously, the planes are going to be the most difficult of all these kind of items on the wish list because it needs a lot of infrastructure, the bases, and all the spare parts to make it work. So whether that would be possible to set that up while Ukraine is being bombed day in, day out is a different question. But I think the most important thing is that even if Western countries don't give him these jets, they're going to give him something else instead. It's about asking big and then getting something in return, even if you don't get your first choice straight away.
Thanks for that, Nick. Nick Connolly in Kyiv.